Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the talk. So I'm Chris Sinco. I'm a UX design lead on the Android developer team. And my colleague Preethi, she's not here, but she's a UX researcher on our team as well. So she'll be joining us remotely for the second half of the talk. So today we're going to talk about demystifying the UX of Jetpack Compose guidance. So our UX team, we're actually made up of a bunch of designers and researchers. We work on kind of everything within the Android developer ecosystem. So Android Studio, we work on libraries like Jetpack Compose and kind of designing the APIs. We also work on developer.android.com and some of the samples. And part of the reason is because, as a developer, when you're building apps, we try to think that the experience actually transcends all of these things together. You're not just using Studio, you're not just using libraries. You use all of these things in conjunction, and so we have to think about all of these things when we're trying to teach people, the latest and greatest in Android, and then also how to make, better apps. But today, we do have a lot to talk about. We'll just focus on some of the work we've been doing on the developer.android.com side. So today, I'm here to share some of the design and research work that we've done to make Compose samples and some of our documentation more usable and approachable for all of you. Actually, how many people have used Compose? This might be a rhetorical question. All right, cool. Just making sure. So let's dive in. So on the sample side, so for those who've tried Compose, which is mostly everyone, you've probably heard of the Jet apps or the Jet samples. So I'm here today to kind of tell you where the origin story was and like why we did it. So, we have a bunch of them. I think we have, I always lose track or lose count. I think we have about 5. So we have Jet Chat, Jet News, Jet Caster, Jet Survey. And each of these apps are meant to kind of be a canonical app that we would imagine developers would build. So, we're thinking like there's a news app or there's a media app or a messaging app because we're Google. We always love building messaging apps. But why did we do this? So we can kind of rewind back to 2019, which feels like decades ago now. Yeah, this is a fun logo. We made these internal things internally as designers. We had this strange code name before called Kitty Hawk with a plane, and anyway, we never launched this logo, thankfully. But back in 2019, when we were planning Compose, when it came to the UI toolkit, there's a lot of widgets out there. And, we're Google, so we have material design. And material design also, there's a great library for it. And they have components for almost everything. But they're also very deep, and there's a lot of functionality within them. So we're trying to figure out, well, we can't build everything exhaustively for the first launch because we just don't have enough time. But what is a way we can kind of scope it down? And so kind of thinking back to the canonical apps, we looked at a bunch of apps. This one so happens to be Medium, and tried to figure out, okay, from a user experience point of view, are there specific components in these apps that we think developers could need at least to get started with the developer preview, which was back in 2019. And eventually when we get to stable, we would start to release more components and more features per component. But for that very first release, we wanted to figure out what is achievable but also useful for people to actually get started with building apps. And part of that process is actually because, part is like identifying what we're going to build and what are the APIs for the toolkit. And as designers, we're thinking, okay, we can identify these things, but how do we actually make sure that they're working as expected? Because if we're designing a toolkit for developers, it should be based on what designers are also trying to do in the ecosystem. And so we actually had this really great relationship, our UX team with the developer relations team, where we would take the APIs that were being developed and designed, we would actually try to implement the app, and then we'd work through the pain and be like, okay, this API isn't quite what we need, or I really want to get this animation right, but then the API doesn't support it yet, so how do we fix that? So then we'd go back to the team and say, hey, can you add this? Can you fix this? Can you make this a little easier to use? Can you change this abstraction? And we do that over and over again and iterate until we actually got a great result. And so the very first app we built was Jet News, inspired by Medium from that previous illustration you saw. And this was meant to be one of those canonical apps that could kind of inspire developers to try out Compose. And it was very well received. I think it's often been cited as back in 2019, the best way to learn Compose. And I think a lot of it is actually attributed to, I think, one of the most important things is it was always up to date. We were releasing Compose maybe every 2 weeks, and it was very hard to keep up, even internally. And so, our documentation kind of always got out of date, and videos and conference talks like these get out of date. And so the best thing we could do is say, okay, we'll put Jet News on GitHub, and then we're just going to update that code as fast as we can. And so a lot of people really love that because they're like, if there's one definitive place to learn from on how the toolkit is evolving, it's Jet News. And so that was why Jet News, I think, was very successful, was always up to date. But I think it was also successful because it was representative. It was actually an app that people felt like they would build and design. It wasn't just, not to be rude, but it wasn't just a developer, developer art, just like, I just hacked this together, it's fine. But we wanted to actually make it, like design it for real. And I think the other part was it was focused. So we didn't try to build, the next greatest news app. We really tried to focus and say, what do we want people to learn from this app? Not just from the API perspective, but like what is possible with the toolkit from the design perspective. And so thinking past Jet News, when we were thinking about the alpha release, we're thinking, okay, I think we're going to need more samples. But which ones do we pick? So this is actually from the material design team. So material design had a bunch of studies, they called them, I think maybe back in 2015, where they did a similar exercise where they tried to pick kind of canonical apps that developers and designers would design and build. And so that's where we took inspiration. We said, okay, we can kind of revisit how we thought about canonical apps before and maybe build out more than just a news app. And so at Alpha, I think this is when the Jet samples really came out, and this GIF is horribly blurry, but forgive me. But we released 5 of the Jet apps, and then we also, I think, speaking to the material studies, we actually implemented some of them in Compose. So at Alpha, we actually had 8 samples that people could learn from that were beautifully designed and technically pretty robust because we had developer relations really making sure that the APIs follow best practices, and we're kind of guiding people to be, this is our opinion about how you should actually build a Compose app. But on the design side, the only way we were going to make this scale was we actually had to create a design system. So we actually approached it as if it were a real product. It's like, okay, let's create the Jet family. So we had a typography, we had colors, we had icons, we actually had common components. But we also didn't want all the apps to look the same because that's pretty boring from a design perspective. And I think also from a learning perspective, you want to see like how can you flex Compose to actually look great and kind of like see how the design systems can scale. So the 2 examples I'll pull out for today is just Jetcaster and JetSnack. I think these are maybe the most interesting Jet samples. So Jetcaster, it's a podcast app, inspired by Spotify and Google Podcasts and some other media apps. And so with Jetcaster, the thing we really wanted to highlight was dynamic theming and transitions, because we thought, this is, animations has always been challenging in Android until now, hopefully. And theming as well, like actually changing the theme on the fly. So there's actually a pretty deep design spec for this. So as you would scroll through the podcast art, it was actually picking up the dominant colors from the artwork. And this was all happening in real time as you scrolled through as, I think it was a pager, or actually we didn't have a pager, we had to build one custom, thanks to Chris here. But part of it was like trying to show people like, hey, like this is a really cool thing that you often see in apps, but it's often very hard to do. And so with Compose, we tried to show folks, hey, this is actually not that hard. But we had to put a lot of thought into it also to make sure we were pulling the right colors in, but also making sure that there's enough color contrast between the background and the foreground. And JetSnack, so JetSnack was inspired by a lot of these food delivery apps. We decided to make it about snacks. I personally love snacks, so it was great. But the intent of this app was to actually push the design system, because I think the feedback we've gotten in the past is, every app looks like Material Design. It all looks the same. But I don't use Material, and I don't want my app to look like Material. How can I do that? And so with Compose, we're like, I think actually Nick Butcher was like, give me something the most non-material. And we did push that. I think we could have pushed it farther, but we tried our best. But the idea here was to show how extensible the theming system could be. So, I think material design has a few colors, or has some like primary, secondary, and I think now they have tertiary. But sometimes those colors don't actually map directly to how designers think, and so one of the things we do know is that designers tend to do semantic design systems. So we thought, okay, if we really had to push that with gradients and creating a a color system that doesn't map directly to material, is that still achievable in Compose, and how hard is that to do? And so you kind of squint, but we had a lot of different colors and also gradients. And then how we applied it to the app was also pretty intuitive. Like some of these carousels, not carousels, sorry, some of these rows here, you can see the gradient is actually spanning across the cards, which again, before with views was quite challenging. And the color does change as you scroll too, so it's not just an image. And then I think at the bottom too, the animation we'll have to replay, but if you notice in the bottom with the navigation bar, we actually tried to do something custom with the animations that, as you can see, the little chip kind of floats around. And that's not something that's necessarily baked into the material navigation bar. But again, we wanted to show people, with just a bit of custom layout code and animation, it's actually pretty easy to do. So thinking beyond 2021, where are we taking the Jet apps now? And so some of this you've actually just seen this week. So large screen is kind of becoming a thing with the Samsung Fold, and I think the Surface Duo 2 also got released recently. So for Android, we want to think, okay, how do we approach this? How do we design apps for large screen and for small screens, for laptop, for foldables, for tablets? And so for Compose, we think, okay, well, how can we lead with the Jet samples? So this is a screenshot of Jet News before this week. And it was pretty awful. Like, we didn't build it for tablet. We just built it for phone. So it just stretched. And this is not the best experience, and you typically do see this in a lot of times. And so we thought, okay, if we actually had more real estate and we had to build this for tablets or foldables, how would we do it? So these are some early explorations. So here it's like, okay, let's actually take advantage of the bigger screen and show, like, maybe we have this like list detail layout. How does the navigation actually come in? Or if you're actually looking at a story, like, could we just full screen the story, or we actually have some, could we have something more interesting on the right and or a toolbar on the left? Let's see. And then even thinking about animation, with these foldable devices, what if we could, I don't think we actually implemented this, but the idea was to stretch the thinking of, like, if we had this really great way to animate based on the sensors, how would we do it? Hopefully we can do this maybe in the future, but I think that's part of the reason we do these Jet samples and really design it for real, is to push the design level, the bar, so that we can actually make better APIs and make everyone's life easier to build beautiful UI. We've also, for Jetcaster, we did do this work. There's a mode for these foldables called tabletop mode. So I think tabletop mode is that one in the bottom right, where you can kind of see the playback on one screen, and then the podcast is kind of playing on the top. But part of this was to demonstrate, like, how would the app adapt based on what state the foldable was in. And this is all with Jetpack Compose, and I believe this code is actually out now for Jetcaster. If you want to dive really deep into it, we did have a recent talk at ADS about building Android UIs for large screens, but we actually have an in-person one later today, and so be sure to check that out. I think Florina and Clara are doing it. And the other thing we've done with the Jet apps, so I think most of you have heard of Material U now. Now it's with Android 12. So again, with Compose, a lot of people are asking, how do we apply Material U to Compose? And so one thing we tried to do is, we didn't have as much time as we'd liked, but we decided, okay, let's take one app and try to apply the Material U dynamic color theming. So today you can go on GitHub, and JetChat is actually the app we decided to apply Material U to. At some point, we'll apply them to all the Jet apps, but for now, it's just Jet Chat. But here you can kind of see with Material U, it's picking up different colors. It's using different color system. Some of the buttons are a little more round. The iconography is a little different. And now, and we actually have it pulling dynamic colors. So in this case, I think the default theme is this blue theme. But if you turn on dynamic color theming, it will actually do the right thing and pull the dominant colors from your wallpaper. It's pretty cool. It's very fast. It actually works instantaneously. And then this is kind of an exploration. Like I said, we'll eventually apply Material U to the other apps. So with Jet News, this is a mock-up that we made earlier where we tried to do something fun. So at some point, hopefully in the near future, you'll actually see this implemented. But actually, if you want to dive deep into Material U, there's another ADS talk about it where Nick Rout actually goes into a lot of depth about how we did the Jet Chat Material U implementation. So to summarize the Jet apps, I think the power of it is that it was opinionated, but we also vetted a lot of it through internal dogfooding. But it also showcases the power and the flexibility, I think, of Jetpack Compose. And I think importantly for us as designers, and I think to aid in or not confuse people, there's actually a consistent narrative about these samples. It's not like maybe next year we'll create a whole different set of samples. We actually wanted to have some continuity, say, to have people kind of follow along as the toolkit evolves, both from when we first started to now when there's new form factors and new things that Material is trying to do. And so this tweet I tweeted a while ago, but some people always say designers are just designing, and it's like, no, every detail in these Jet apps actually had intent behind it, all tied to the API, all for developers. So with that, I will hand it over to Preethi, who will talk more about the research she's done.
Chris, hello everyone. I'm a researcher on the Compose team, so it's nice seeing everyone there. So we're now going to switch topics, as Chris mentioned, and I'm going to talk about some of the design research efforts our team has been pursuing. Let's see if we can get this to work. All right, I think that's working. All right, cool. So many of you might have seen this survey pop up quite a few times during your visit to the official Android developer website in the last couple of months. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give you like a highlight summary of how your responses to these survey questions directly influenced some of the design decisions that were made for the website. Right. We sort of set out to gather feedback from the developer community over like 6 months ago. And our goal was to understand why people visit the website, right? And what they find helpful, if anything was missing, what was missing based off of real world needs. And to do this, we leaned on the happiness tracking survey. In short, it's called HATS. And this is a pretty cool technique that you can also use for the great products that you're creating. And it's basically surveying in the context of product usage, right? This helped us understand developer attitudes and experiences, but at a large scale, right? We were able to reach people in different parts of the world and try and understand their needs. And what we were trying to do was, this is basically a short questionnaire that helped measure developer satisfaction with the content and the design of the website. And then this was used as a part of gauging the overall quality of the website's user experience. And by happiness, what we really mean is it's a set of metrics, such as like, overall satisfaction, likelihood to recommend using the website, perceived frustrations and attitudes towards like just the content and the design. But we didn't actually use all of these metrics, but you can attribute all of these to happiness. And I'll speak about how we use this technique, or how we tailored this for our needs. But I would encourage folks to go, read this paper in your free time to know more about how you can take advantage of this very simple technique. Now, going back to what we did, we attempted to connect the information around who is visiting a specific page on the website, why they are visiting that page, what they thought about the usefulness and accuracy of the content on that page, and what other content could be included for it to be helpful for their context. And we were kind of initially skeptical about this approach because we weren't sure if developers would have the time in the first place to share their feedback, right? So your time is super valuable, and you're trying to come to the website to learn something and then go on with your work. And almost every product out there in the world is seeking feedback. So this might probably be lost in that effort, where people would be like, oh, this is just another survey. I don't want to spend time responding to this. And to some extent, we were also thinking that well, would this mean that this is like causing a survey fatigue, especially if the survey includes something like an open-ended text box where people can share like free text. And we were also kind of concerned with the quality of the feedback. Like, even if someone shared feedback, how detailed would it be for us to make sense and understand the context or the need of the developer, so that we can meet it to the best of our efforts. And I will actually negate some of the skepticism as we keep going through the rest of the slide. We were pleasantly surprised. Now, to give you a quick highlight of what we have been learning these past 6 months, what has remained really consistent. We saw that folks visiting the website in general, they shared positive feedback, and there was this appetite for more content, right? So, to give you an example, here is here is an open-ended text feedback from when we had released during beta release, right? So here the person is from Colombia, and they had self-reported that they are a professional developer, and they mentioned that they had a feedback about the video snippets, right? So they say, please keep adding video snippets. They provide much needed context on view interaction and help solidify what the code snippets are actually doing. And then closer to around IO of this year, we saw more similar feedback. Here's again like a representative quote where the person claimed to be working on apps as a part of their hobby. They're from Austria. They mentioned how documentation is becoming better, but they would like to see something like a release map, so they know where the product is moving forward. And then closer to stable release, we saw someone who claimed themselves to be like a self-learner, not necessarily professionally creating apps, and they're from UK. And they mentioned how, generally speaking, they were thanking us for the tutorials. And they also mentioned, and this was really pretty powerful for our team, because when we saw feedback similar to this, it really made us feel like we are making a difference. Right, so here the person says, you've provided a way for me to learn a skill that can allow me to find a job, which I do not have at the moment. Keep up the good work. Right, so, but this was not the only thing, right? So all of this is great. There's positive feedback, and then there's been like a consistent pattern over time. But things did have to change as well, right? And one of the things that I'm going to talk about in this talk is the getting started experience. Right, we had to go through a pretty long journey with earlier days with developers having a lot of paper cuts, and especially issues finding their way on the website, figuring out where they should be and what they should be looking for, and spending a lot of time in that process. So this is a representative quote from earlier this year. This was like closer to March of this year. This person claimed to be like a self-learner. They're learning Compose, on their own for school or for work, and they're from India. And they mentioned that you've created a bunch of starting points but how can a user decide which one to choose, right? So back then we had, and even now we have some of this, but we have actually organized it in a much better way. But in March, earlier this year, we had like a view tutorial link, and then there was like the pathway, and then there's like core concepts, and there was and this person says there's no description on what the tutorial covers. Like, pathway and core concepts have brief overviews, but what criteria should be considered in choosing one over the other, right? So people were having this kind of a choice paradox. And really, the takeaway for us from this was, we want to make it very easy for someone to spend the least amount of time deciding what they should be doing, right? And how easy can we make it for someone to quickly onboard and get started to understanding what is Compose, and how can we make it easy for them to set up their environment so they can get started coding or exploring some of the sample apps. And so the journey has been similar to what I have in the slide here. So closer to beta, as I mentioned earlier, we had like the view tutorial and at the top, and then there's like the pathway in the middle band, and then at the bottom of this image on the left, we have like the core concepts. So there are too many things going on, but closer to stable, we try to reorganize this content and make it a bit more clear for people to know where they should be going and to be able to find what they are looking for. So we organized a tutorial and pathway together, and then we sort of organized the guides in a different section. We featured some of these resources as these are the resources you may want to look at first, depending on where you are in your journey of learning Compose. And we were also able to surface a couple of foundational insights. And I think this is super exciting for me and for my team to be able to share with the community. So, for instance, we learned that visitors to DAC can actually face a dilemma. Right, so they come in with this knowledge of this is what I know about Android app development, and sometimes those can get challenged with Compose. And that can cause a little bit of dilemma, and that it can involve a little bit of conflict resolution, right? So this would mean that they would have to relearn a concept. So here's an example, right? So one of the representative quotes, this is from a professional developer in US, and this was, again, closer to July of this year. This person says, historically, we would create custom views in Android when we needed something truly custom. And I'm trying to find how a custom view maps to in the Compose way of doing things. Right? So example, if I needed a view for a custom graph for a new project, would the best way be to write a custom view for the graph still? Or is there some other Compose way of creating this? So here the person is basically just trying to understand how they can apply what they already know from the non-Compose world in the context of Compose. Another interesting piece of foundational insight that we learned from this 6-month effort is that visitors to the website often wear a specific intent hat, right? So they come in with a specific intent, and they can actually switch between intents as they are during a visit, right? So and I'm going to talk about what these intents are. We actually identified 4 intents at a high level in looking at all of these survey responses, and I'm going to just share a summary for each of these intents. So the first one is seeker, right? So there you go. All right. So as a seeker, when the visitor has this intent of being a seeker, they basically want to learn Compose concept or look for a specific reference, right? So for instance, they would want to find out like methods or parameters that are supported by an API. And then they would want more like a deep dive explanation of concepts. And they would want resources like images and videos to sort of scaffold that learning process. And typically, we found from the responses that people were seeking quick ways to troubleshoot issues, especially when they were, getting started with creating a new project, or when they were using one of the sample projects and they wanted to, quickly learn. The second intent is when the person is trying to be a decider, right? So typically, what they are trying to do is with this intent, they're trying to decide if they should use something or not. And this actually even includes if they should continue the rest of their time exploring and knowing what Compose is, right? And typically we saw people share feedback along the lines of they would want to know what is unique about Compose, and they would typically seek something like, hey, I would like to have an interactive or a lightweight coding experience so that I can quickly code something, see how that works in Compose, so that can help me make a decision better. And then the next intent was when someone came in with this intent of just looking for news and updates, right? And oftentimes we saw people requesting access to something like a personalized learning experience. They would suggest things like, you need to break out your website into like something that's comfortable for a beginner to something who that's comfortable for someone who might be intermediary or advanced in their journey for Compose or even just Android app development. right? And they were often seeking like latest news and updates just to help them again make a decision on how they can commit to exploring Compose. And then the last intent is when the person is just coming to the website out of curiosity, or they want to seek something that's fun, right? So oftentimes they are learning something without a specific goal in mind, so they would come in just to see has someone else created anything that I can continue to explore off of, right? And they are seeking answers to like specific questions as they are continuing on their exploration in this in the same way. Now, all of this is not to say that we don't have casual browsers. We did come across, responses where people um, could have been casual browsers. They may not have had predetermined goal, and oftentimes, they may be visiting the website just to understand is, what's unique, what's new, is there anything fun? But what happens with casual browsers is that they could form goals during a visit, right? And we actually saw that because we were able to see based off of where they responded to the survey from the page they were on the website, we were able to infer that during the visit someone may have formed a goal and they might have started consuming like tutorials, and that might have caused them to subsequently look for more specific information to clarify questions. And here is, again, a representative code. Here, the person claims to be a professionally developing a professional developer, where they say, I came across side effects, and need more use cases on on when to use it and when not to, with alternatives and reasons. All right, and one other interesting theme we actually saw from the survey responses is how much the community is super passionate about making guidance more usable and learning in general, right, more easy for everyone. Right, so we saw feedback where developers were sort of proposing solutions to make learning on the website effective. Right. So here are a few quotes. So one person says, provide glitch-like functionality. I would like to see like interactive code snippets. Another person says, I want some live, ready to run examples that'll help. And then another person said, I think that at the end of each topic, there could be a reference to a sample that talks about the content of the session. And then there's one more where this person says, try to include a troubleshooting section where you list the common problems that can occur when using Compose and how to resolve them. Now, all of this was great, right? But then they were more like one-liner ideas. And we wanted to actually hear more from the developers as to how they would want us envision, how they envision each of these ideas, right? So to sort of support that, we invited developers to a more like a co-design participatory session. And we worked with them. We basically just collaborated with them to understand where they were coming from and what they thought about learning and how they can make learning more like a 10x kind of experience, right? And this was more like a 90-minute session. And, we created more like low fidelity sketches. In fact, Chris played a key role in this, where he was like, as we heard developers speak, Chris was actually starting to make like sketches, and this was in a remote setting, by the way. So it was pretty interesting. This was a great experience for us to understand, where the needs are coming from. And one of the things that was much more interesting is that we actually saw striking similarity to what we saw in the survey responses. Now, to give you a little bit of background, we did not invite the developers who had responded to these surveys because we didn't know who was responding to these surveys, right? Every response is anonymized. So we invited developers who had signed up to participate in user research. And interestingly, whatever ideas that emerged from most of these sessions, they aligned with these ideas that we saw come through in these survey responses. And here's an example of that, right? So on the left here are the survey responses. There were quite a few, and I just pulled two here. So one of it says video tutorials would have been much better. The other one says I want diagrammatic explanations and video tutorials. And these were by respondents to the survey. And the image on the right is the sketch we created at the end of the co-design session, and this was with a developer who may or may not have responded to the survey, right? So we don't know that either. And this was we randomly just reached out to a developer and we were like, hey, would you be interested to join us for this session? And this is basically what we saw. So without going into the details of the actual sketch, at a high level, what the sketch is referring to is this person was envisioning tutorials as something like tutorials plus plus, where they would want to see videos to offer like a lightweight and quick learning experience. A few other things we saw from this research, just taking a step back, these research efforts have been super beneficial for our team, right? So on the one end, it kind of provided validation for ongoing efforts. Right? So earlier this year, we had video snippets, and we started to see a lot of feedback on this feature. Right? So people, one of the responses here says, please keep adding video snippets. They provide much needed context. Right. And then one other thing we saw was it really helped us prioritize items that were already in. I may have lost you guys. So let me see if I can share my screen again. All right. So yeah, so right before I lost you, I was saying there's one other thing that we learned from this experience, which is we were able to prioritize items that were already in our pipeline. So here's an example where we saw a lot of people requesting like a component gallery, more so like just knowing what are the different Compose components that one can use. And then here's another example where a person was requesting for something like a release roadmap. And then one other thing this helped with was it increased opportunities for empathy building and cross-functional collaboration. And this is an example where we were creating like newsletters. This was actually created by an engineer on our team. So one of the things we want to continue exploring is to support or provide a scaffold for people to quickly learn and onboard to Compose, implementing Compose apps. We do have a hypothesis that learning is a process where one can transition from more like peripheral to more complex learning activities as they grow in confidence. And this is something that we are hoping to continue to pursue as a line of research in the near future. So that's a quick peek of how you've directly influenced Compose guidance. So next time you see a survey pop up, do take some time, let us know what you think and what you need. To kind of summarize this whole talk, Compose guidance can actually span across a spectrum. As Chris mentioned earlier in the talk, it can go anywhere from like the tools to the APIs to the content that you see on our website. If you're interested in participating in more research, yeah, there's a link in here. Please do sign up. You will be invited for one of the sessions, and we'll find one that works for you. So with that, thank you very much for listening to this talk. I think we are open to questions if we have time. So thank you.
Hello? Oh, you can go to the, yeah. Oh. Oop.
Shall I go or?
Sure.
I have to go to the mic.
Oh.
All right. Hello.
Hi.
Maybe the question is not going to be fully related with the talk, but as yeah,
okay.
sorry. I have a UX guy here from the Android, the Google team, so I need to make this question. Sorry. Most of us developers, okay, Android developers who works in companies with UI and UX people that are iOS users, we find like very difficult to sell them things like check guys check what Android is offering you, like in this Jet Snack application. It's so cool, it looks awesome, we would like to implement something like that. And then our UI UX team is like yes but no, because whatever. So, what advice can you guys give us in order to sell Android Compose animations and make it like more visible in applications that need to be Android and iOS, and they need like let's say common solution that it's going to work across platforms? Thank you, and sorry for the question.
Yeah, that's is a tough question. I think we struggle with this internally for apps that Google makes. I think one of the challenges is I'm guilty of this myself as a designer. Not a lot of designers are not familiar with Android. Even just they've never used an Android phone or have never tried it, which I think is a shame because I think Android has come a long way. And when I first tried Android years ago, I wasn't too happy about the experience compared to iOS. But I think it's changed a lot, and I think both systems have influenced each other a lot. But that's kind of, I think, the first step is that the designers, I feel like to be a good designer, just in general, you need to understand the context you're working with. And so if you're designing an app for Android, like you should know what an Android phone is like. And so how is it different from iOS, from the interaction perspective? Like how's navigation work? How does dark theming work? Like what possibilities are there? And I think I get frustrated with fellow designers when they don't do that kind of homework or diligence to understand the platform they're designing for, which is a shame. But we can't necessarily change the phones people buy. I think that's one thing we've tried to do with the Jet samples is to really design it as if we had to actually ship an app. But to push it so that it's like to show these designers who always thought Android it was never sexy or the animations were terrible, that no, it's very possible and it's very easy. I think we've done a lot of great, I think I would say, marketing back maybe this year where we had these developer challenges where people would build apps as fast as they could. And it's pretty amazing, like some of the submissions, like for the weather app, actually the weather apps were beautiful, like really beautiful. But it was amazing because like people did it over a weekend, and I think part of it is like getting the word out that designing and building for Android is very easy now, or relatively easy. Let's not get too carried away. But from a design perspective, we shouldn't feel limited to like, oh, this is too hard to do on Android, or like no one appreciates this on Android. And I think with Android 12 coming out, and like I think with Compose, we're really trying to push design to be a hallmark of Android, which I think, unfortunately, I think it hasn't been, because people tend to look at iOS and think that's where the best design is. But I would disagree. So I think though, yeah, how to get the designers in there. I think we have some other efforts. Like I think we're exploring an idea of like how to export from Figma to Jetpack Compose. I think that's a great step because I think for designers, it's like I built this in Figma, I hand it off to the developer, and they're like, I can't do it, or it just takes too much time, or something gets lost in translation. So I think building those tools will help guide, or I think influence designers to feel more like Android is, I guess the best way to put it, more welcoming for them. I think that's also an approach too. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. And I can talk to them too if you want. Designer to designer. So. Okay.